Well, hey there, sweet peas. Welcome back to Friendless. I'm your host, James Avramenko, and I am fighting off a bit of a cold, so I'm going to sound real stuffy for this intro. Before we launch into this week's episode, I want to give you a little bit of context, because if you're not already familiar with my guest's work, I think it's going to make what you're about to hear land a bit harder. Garth Mullins is a journalist, a podcaster, an activist, and the author of a brand new memoir called Crackdown, Surviving and Resisting the War on Drugs. He is also the host of the Crackdown podcast, which has been doing some of the most important documentary work on the overdose crisis in this country for years now. He is a longtime member of VANDU, the Vancouver area network of drug users, one of the oldest and most influential drug user rights organizations, not only in Vancouver, but in North America. Garth is also someone who has used drugs, who has lived through 2 overdose crises, who's lost friends, close friends, colleagues, co-creators to a poison drug supply that, he argues in this conversation, compellingly and meticulously, did not have to be. His book is a memoir, but it's also an indictment. It's also a love letter to his community. It's also one of the most readable, honest pieces of writing that I've come across in a very long time. This episode was recorded live at the Book Warehouse in Vancouver. It's part of the ongoing monthly live recording series that we've been collaborating on. And I will be honest with you, I was really nervous going into this one. I had been so bowled over by the book and just by all the work that Garth does that I really didn't want to mess it up. What I didn't expect was how much Garth would give back, how generous he would be, how funny, and how clearly direct he would be in his message. I know I walked out of this interview feeling like a completely changed person, and I really feel like you're going to do the same. So it's time to lean back, get comfy, set your volume at a reasonable level, and enjoy my interview with Garth Mullins, live at the Book Warehouse, here on Friendless. This week on Friendless, I have a guest that I have been really excited to chat with, someone who I've been admittedly kind of psyching myself out all week, just because the book he's just written was absolutely incredible, and I feel a lot of different emotions about chatting with you, and I have a lot of things I want to ask you about. But anyway, before I spin myself away, the one, the only, Garth Mullins. How are you today?
Thanks, James. I'm stoked to be here. I'm honored to be here. I think it's pretty cool to have a podcast in a bookstore. There's 2 things I like, books and radio, and mixing them together, you can't beat it.
So your book, Crackdown, Surviving and Resisting the War on Drugs, I wrote it down so that I could remember which one came first. Yeah.
I've had that trouble live in interviews myself. You got to survive before you resist.
There you go. Exactly. Right. An absolutely incredible book. One that I have been just like pushing on everyone that I know to read. But before we really dive into that, because, amongst other things, you run your own podcast called Crackdown as well. You're a journalist, you're an activist. But, beyond those sort of chyrons, a question I always like to open my interviews with is who the hell are you?
Most recently, I'm a dad, and that it just fits like a glove. I love it. I've got promoted to be in the best job that I've ever had, and I'm coming to it a little late in life. I'm middle-aged, but I'm so glad and honored I got the opportunity. So, and Debbie here, who runs a bookstore, gave me some books for the little guy to take home. He loves books. So maybe raising another reader, maybe another author. I don't know.
Right? Yeah. Give him 20 years. Yeah.
I'm also a member of just the small and shrinking community of sort of old school, back in the day dope fiends who found their way to heroin early in life, and there's not so many of us who are still alive. I'm sort of one of them, and my friends are, and I'm trying to keep everybody alive in the small contributions I can make to that.
Thank you for opening with that. I know one of the sort of through lines throughout the book was you kind of grappling with talking about this stuff publicly and sort of embracing every facet of yourself. And so I'm curious, behind the scenes, what prompted you to go to a book now? Because you've got your podcast and because you have all your other work, everything that you do. What was it about the book that kind of called to you right now in this moment?
Is the money. I mean, I don't know if you know, but Canadian authors become fantastically wealthy.
Yeah, I've heard it's very lucrative. Yeah.
I guess, well, honestly, a publisher, Penguin Random House, approached me, and my partner, Lisa, she said, when somebody offers you money to write, The answer is always yes. And she's the smart one in the family, so I followed that. But it's also because on the podcast, I've asked people, friends and people in the community, to share deeply of themselves and their life story. Somebody said to me, wow, as the interviewer, you share a little bit, but not as much as you ask people to. And I said, that's a good point. Fair enough. So I thought I'd share my own story. And really, the original idea for the book was sort of a series of essays about different topics, different themes and parts of the drug war. But I realized that the memoir format is just way more approachable and readable. And I like to read a story about a person more than a bunch of essays. And so it just naturally went in that direction. So I kind of had to rewrite it partway through. And that thing of kind of looking back at your life and what you did and talking to your family about it is kind of liberating. It's a lot of stuff that I feel real ashamed about, or I used to feel real ashamed about.
Sure.
And part of the story is getting over that shame. You know, like my previous experience, like back in the day, going in a bookstore like this, I'd probably get followed around by security. I wouldn't be sitting here with a book that I signed in the bookstore where people buy and being talking about something like this. I never thought people would want to talk about something like this, you know, like surviving drug use and drug war and all that stuff. I was so ashamed about that stuff. I never thought to be talking about it publicly or at all. I never used to want to talk about it at all.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. You know, shame as a sort of concept is such a central central part of my life, and something that I find
What are you
myself...
ashamed of, James?
Well, you know, funny you should ask that. Which prompts me back to something you mentioned just earlier about this idea of, as the interviewer, you end up sharing so much less than the guest. You know, how much time you got? You know,
It's not really a fair question,
Yeah.
right? Because I wasn't prepared to share that part of my life until I was.
Yeah.
And if somebody had asked me about it before, I wouldn't have been volunteering anything. So
That's exactly
it's
it.
not really fair to you or anybody on the spot about shame.
But I feel like what's such a fascinating element is something that the way I reckon with it myself is this idea of, you know, for me, it's not necessarily that the shame itself goes away so much as I figure out how to sort of work, not around it, but I work with it, and how to remember that, you know, that emotion's going to come back, but it's just a little less loud each time, right? You know, and sharing is such a massive element of it, to realize that it's like, oh yeah, I'm not there anymore. These are now just words, you know, and I get to sort of choose what power them.
For me, it was like there was this whole person inside that I couldn't acknowledge or tell
Yes.
anybody about.
Yeah.
And when I finally got to get rid of this shame, it's like myself that was divided sort of healed up into one whole person. There wasn't anything. I didn't have a secrets anymore.
Yeah.
And I didn't have anything that I was ashamed about and embarrassed about. You know, like for a long time, I just didn't want. I mean, my family kind of knew. They didn't know how bad it was.
Yeah.
I just didn't want anyone to know. Like, I stick a needle in my arm and inject drugs every day, several times a day for many years, do things I'm not proud of to get the money for it, willing to risk death and jail time and all this.
Yeah.
And, you know, I never thought I'd be able to say any of that stuff, that would be a secret part of me that I personally hated. But now I understand that part of me was trying to survive. I was using heroin for a reason, for a rational reason, because, you know, I was a traumatized kid, and that helped me feel all right. And maybe I would have been worse off if I didn't find that little salvation, that little time out that heroin gave me.
That's exactly right. You know, in a certain perspective, I think it's a part of why you're still here. All the pieces all play together, right?
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in the book is sort of bookended in a lot of ways with ceremonies around death and ceremonies around grief, and I'm curious about, you know, playing on this idea of shame and just these really heavy, hard emotions. How are you finding grief factoring into the work that you do, and how are you, or are you using it as a fuel rather than sort of a paralytic, you know?
Grief has grown up with me, or I've grown up with it.
Yeah.
People have been dying in my life since I was a kid. And thanks. Debbie brought us some water. Very thoughtful.
It was.
Yeah, grief has been growing alongside of me since I was a kid. Lost people really young. I've been to dozens of times more funerals than I have to graduation ceremonies or baby showers or weddings. And that sort of changes you, and also when you're using drugs during an overdose crisis, and now I've lived through two, or this is the second one that's ongoing now, and there was one in the 90s, the death is also stalking you. And so it gives you an opportunity to feel all the feelings. You just feel sad, you feel bereft, you feel abandoned, you feel angry, just endless anger. This wasn't necessary. You feel anger at all kinds of different places. Finally, as I've come to get a handle on, the drug war is actually a political decision made over a century ago, and that we have toxic, deadly drugs because they're illegal and unregulated, that my anger is now aimed at the government, who insists on doing this even though we have plenty of evidence to show that a regulated, safe supply of opioids can save lives, would stop the mass dying overnight. In fact, it saved my life. Yeah. I'm here because of a pharmaceutical regulated prescribed opioid. So I guess death has just been all around, and that grief has been all around. And in the book, we start in the 90s with my friend Nick's funeral, where his cause of death, which is overdose, is not admitted by the family. It's not discussed at the funeral. The people who are his friends, who are also sort of drug users, were sitting at the back. The family doesn't really want to acknowledge us. They're kind of mad at us. They kind of blame us. We can't properly mourn our brother because of this alienation. And then, we go 20 years later into the, 2020s, early 2020s. And we have a ceremony in Oppenheimer Park led by, an elder from Musqueam, Squamish, and Sinemuch. And these elders, these matriarchs for their nations, hold a blanketing ceremony to blanket the people that we've lost, and we each stand up for them in representation of them, and we are blanketed, and the blanket represents healing for our grief, but also a sort of a blanketing for them, the lost person. That was a totally different kind of a ceremony, a different kind of a funeral, because it brought us together instead of leaving us alienated. It made us feel like something was lifted on us. Then we were all leaving with a private stone to carry. And, throughout the book, you see people die that I lose. And at the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, we often have memorials for people. And I've organized dozens myself. And we often say that when someone dies, a member of Vandu dies, we never take them off the membership list. They're a member forever. We always remember them. We put their pictures on the walls, and we always try to remember them. And so the editorial board that is responsible for making Crackdown the podcast with me, half of them that we started out with are gone. And so we try to remember those names instead of letting them quietly be erased in shame. We try to shout them out to the world, So people like Charisse Kiwat, people like Tracy Morrison, Greg Ferez, Dave Murray, these people that we made the podcast with, we love them, and we want to hold them close and Shelda Castor, who died more recently, we don't want their names to be forgotten in shame. We want them to carry on. So I say them all at the end of every podcast as part of the credits. I don't take them off the list either.
Yeah.
So how we think about death and grief has changed for me a lot. And where it's settled with me is that we have to share it communally.
Yes.
We were always supposed to. That's what a funeral is for.
That's right.
But the way we seem to do it in the late stage capitalism in the West or whatever just seems to be this funny, awkward thing where you call it a celebration of life. You can say any word except for the word death. You can say your phone is dead, but you can never say my mother is dead.
Yeah, they passed.
Yeah, right. There's always something to try and put it away, but you actually need to hold it close. And so I've walked with death more, and I guess that's part of my journey or my life.
The idea of capitalism as just a culture of euphemisms, and the way that just they're constantly veiling and obfuscating and just hiding,
Well, we even use this word, or I came into this concept 5 or 6 years ago of necropolitics, which is it's made by the idea was thought of by this guy Hili Mbembe. I don't think I'm saying the name right, but he's a political thinker, and he was talking about the colonial processes in Africa. But the theory has been applied to different situations where the state chooses who's going to live and who's going to die.
Yes.
And so the government, knowingly by choice of policy and budgeting, and all of the elements of the state, have exposed whole communities of people to premature death, to slow death, to injury, knowingly. Not that it's an accident or a force of nature. It's a force of policy. It's decisions made and maintained by people with names who are voted for. And so we use that word necropolitics because it's the politics of death, of choosing death for us, and nobody has been unseated because of it. No minister has lost their portfolio. No premier has had to resign. No prime minister lost their job. No junior policy analyst or administrator has been fired. There's been no political cost for our deaths. For helping us, there's a political cost. There's a feared political cost. So now governments are afraid to do something that would be helpful to drug users.
Yeah. Jesus.
You want to take that smoke break?
You talked a little bit about the way your book developed, right? You talked about this idea of it was going to be essays. I saw you somewhere else had described it as it began as a manifesto, and it has since developed into that memoir. How are you finding that having your story kind of physicalized, and sort of in its own not packaged, that's maybe the wrong, but how are you finding it useful as another tool towards, policy agitation or these things that you just brought up?
Well, it's helpful because it is part memoir and part manifesto. And I have used memoir as the container for a lot of ideas and arguments. And I did it because that's what I've realized I like is I like to read about people. I like someone to sort of take my hand and lead me through. I realize that's the job I do as the host on Crackdown. And that's probably my strongest writing. And really, I had this early chapter, and it was on how the drug war got started, and actually started in Canada here in Vancouver in 1907, 1908. And so I wrote that history, and I gave it to my best friend Jeff. And me and Jeff have been friends for 35 years. We've been drug users together. We've had each other's back. We're brothers. And so he's the first person I wanted the opinion. So I left him I printed it out, left him a draft of it. Came back the next day, and he said, "This is really interesting. It reads like an encyclopedia." and I was like, "Oh yeah," because there's a lot of footnotes. There was a lot of footnotes and everything like that. And he wasn't being mean or anything. He's like, it doesn't really sound like you.
Yeah.
And I said, "What should I do?" He says, "Just keep it simple, keep it real." And it sounds trite, but when he says it, he lives by that motto. He never fronts. He never puts up any kind of fake anything. He doesn't even really like to do small talk to put people at ease. He's just like so persistently himself.
Yeah.
And so I took his advice, and I really just tried to write in my voice. There's no footnotes. There's no studies. And part of the reason I did that is because, I don't know, I got this long history of I feel like I'm not believed. I feel like drug users aren't believed. People are always like, "Oh, you're exaggerating, or you're lying, or you're pulling a scam, or that can't be true, or whatever." All the way back to, you hear rumors on the street in the 90s, "Oh, don't go out to this particular farm because, people are getting killed there." And I heard the rumors, and I was just like, that sounds fantastical, but it was true, right? It was the Picton farm. But people didn't believe what they were hearing. And so I just wanted to always put all these studies and footnotes and references and I've gone to school to try and get degrees, and just always try to find more and more ways. And I just thought, no, I'm going to go with Jeff, and people can believe me or not. It's going to be very truthful. And of course, I fact checked the book thoroughly, and then I had the people at Penguin Random House, even in the contract, when I signed the contract, I said, I want someone to go over it and fact check everything, and then legally do it too. And so they did, and they came back to me. "Where did you find this? How do you know this? Blah blah blah." So it was important. It was true to me, but I'm not trying to use footnotes and all that
Sure.
razzmatazz on people. And so that's that's how the memoir became the container for policy, so I can use it as a tool. But you said, how does the book feel as an object that contains your life? And it's just like, the other thing is, I can close it.
Yes.
It's written down, and there's some real hard parts in there.
Yeah.
And it forced me to have a bunch of discussions with my family. It's all out there, and I can kind of close it and put it away and say, that's like, my kid was born last year. I'm going on and doing other stuff, and maybe I can put that away a little bit. It's who I am, but like, I don't have to always have the book open.
So within the book, and I know on the podcast as well, you've talked about this idea of it's really easy to scare people with a simple story, and kind of how you can boil things down and sort of erase the nuance of life. And it's far easier, or it's far more difficult to sort of explain what's actually really going on, I think in the grander context of what we're talking about the overdose crisis and what's happening not only in the city but across the country, I think to sort of lay the foundation of this, from your perspective, what is that sort of simple story that's being sold to people, and what is the more complicated truth behind it, do you find?
I think the simple story is, classic drug war propaganda that involves, blaming the people. So, people made bad decisions or are of bad character to begin with.
Of course.
Our cities are falling apart because we've had this progressive liberal policy that has coddled addicts for too long, when it's actually not the case. We've still continued to lock people up. We've still continued to spend most of the money on courts, police, and jails. There has been some harm reduction pilot projects, and it's true that there are available now syringes like that there weren't when I was starting out. But this is how we also reduced the spread of HIV back when it was rampaging through this city in the 90s. So, the stories are blaming the attempts to fix it. So saying the small amounts of prescribing of Dilaudid, for example. People are prescribed Dilaudid to use instead of street drugs. Well, it's not a great choice there by the government to use that one, because it's not as strong as street drugs. It's not a great substitute, but it's better than nothing. And people do find gives them a lot of help. It doesn't completely solve the problem, but it gets you a lot of the way there. But the simple story is that that's what's causing the problem.
Right.
Is this Dilaudid's getting out there, it's being diverted, school children are getting a hold of it. That's what's causing the problem.
Yeah.
It's people are not dying from Dilaudid. People are dying from the illegal street drug supply. People continue to take things like methadone and Dilaudid, which is hydromorphone, very effectively, and there are not overdose deaths from the safe supply program. But that doesn't stop politicians like Pierre Poilievre from blaming the safe supply prescribing and saying that's what's causing the deaths. Or another one is in Vancouver, or in British Columbia, we had decriminalization for about 14 months, where nobody was charged for, or supposed to be, nobody was charged with the possession of small amounts of drugs. But
did you witness that actually? Did they actually play by that, or was that just sort of a...
Well, the stats suggest that there was a 77% reduction in possession offenses, which is great. That means that thousands of people weren't charged and didn't go to jail. I went to jail first for possession when I was 19, so that's really good. But you would have thought it would have been 100%.
Right.
But
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
if it's decriminalization. But I guess, not all cops got the message. I don't know. But the point is that was really good. But the simple story is, the streets are full of chaos and there's all this urban blight because of decriminalization. Well, there's lots of people in the streets, and it's not because of decriminalization, and the streets of Vancouver and the streets of Toronto are both full of people, but Toronto never had decriminalization. We're seeing people living rough all over the country because rents are incredibly high. because wages have never kept pace, and lots of people are living in tents who work in the morning, and because groceries are so expensive. But politicians like to dump this stuff at the door of decriminalization, especially if they never intend to do anything about those other things that are causing the problem.
Yeah.
So it's, it's that same old thing. It's the scapegoating and the bait and switch, and it's a classic of the right wing, the far right. When I was watching TV in 2022 in the winter, and I saw the convoy in Ottawa, I saw this, there's a big demonstration that occupied the city for 3 weeks. Very well organized supply lines of food and diesel, and setting up hot tubs and all this stuff. Millions of dollars in donations coming in. I just thought that they are really well organized, and if they ever find out about harm reduction, we are in big trouble.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they did. And the right and the far right, basically the same people, the same movement that Trump is at the head of in Canada here, have targeted harm reduction. But they haven't only targeted drug users; they've targeted trans kids and immigrants, and and it's the same old thing that's been used for over a century. It's targeting marginalized people instead of the people at the top of society. They're kicking down and kicking people at the bottom of it.
It's the easiest people, is the most vulnerable. It's it's a really, really haunting passage of your book is when you talk about the first overdose crisis only really ending because there weren't enough people left to die and to sort of maintain the numbers being high. And I feel like that really, that sort of echoes what I feel is kind of happening right now in a lot of ways of they're sort of just waiting for the population to burn itself out in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, that was Dr. Blatherwick from the Vancouver Richmond Health Board was being interviewed by Travis Lupick for a book called Fighting for Space. And he said exactly that. He said, I think Travis asked him, why did the first crisis end? And he said it just burned itself out. And my friend and mentor, Laura Shaver, says something like, if the government ever gets around to doing anything about this, there won't be any of us left.
Yeah.
And so she's saying the same thing about this crisis. And I mean, we have seen so many people die in Vancouver, East Van here. Just even in the Vancouver area network of drug users, we have lost our whole leadership. Trained new leadership, lost them. Like we just are bereft of people so badly. Our movement is in tatters because of the amount of death that it's experienced over the last decade. And I worry that that's true, that we'll see the numbers continue to come down, not because there's been any dramatic intervention, not because the drug supply is getting any less lethal. In fact, it's getting more, but because there's just less of us. Statistics Canada says that there are not new addicts being created.
Right.
Like there's not, the amount of people with opioid use disorder or substance use disorder is flat. Like it's not going up. So if that's true, and I think it is, because I see the group of us aging. I think the youth are using drugs. Youth always use drugs, but I just think it's replacing at the same rate. So we're going to see this maybe eventual reduction as people are killed off.
Jesus. Another element, I think one of the things I'm trying to scratch at here is this idea of like sometimes we can end up using sort of these ubiquitous words, things like, the system or these types of things, and when we talk about the idea of an element of this book being an indictment of a broken system, and we've already sort of, you've illustrated this idea of, the politicians and these elements, but how would you go about sort of explaining what the system is to somebody who, is sort of trying to understand and trying to find a way to engage, but doesn't really know exactly where to start?
Right. Well, I mean, we've done this as a group, the people at the Vancouver area network of drug users, we set aside a few days and have meetings, and we put a diagram on the board, like where is the problem that we're facing coming from? If we talk about the overdose crisis, right? So we're looking at what ministries could be funding solutions. Well, that's the Ministry of Health, and also formerly the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. and that ministry is now gone. We know there's also a federal Ministry of Health. We know that within each of those ministries, there are different directorates and departments. We know that there's deputy ministers and associate and assistant deputy ministers. We know there's directors, and we know who they are. We've had meetings with them.
Yeah.
We know there's premiers, and there's people in the premier's office. We know that there's ministerial assistants, right? So we know these policies are generated in cabinet. We know that the cabinet committees that generate them, both in the federal and the provincial level. We know that some things are a federal and some things are a provincial responsibility. Some things are the police and happen through the Police Act in BC or municipally. So it depends on what aspect we're looking at. You know, the College of Physicians and Surgeons plays a role because their doctors prescribe to us and they're under those rules. The College of Pharmacists plays a role because they also are involved in dispensing medications like methadone. So there's this kind of, once you start drawing, you get this yarn diagram of different parts of the state, but the state speaks to this large apparatus of elected and unelected people, including, you know, police and health authorities. And then you ask, well, what are the instruments? That's the who, but what are they using? And it goes back to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which you trace back its iterations all the way back. You get the Opium Act of 1908, and that's the first thing that threw a big blanket across the population of prohibition. But before that, the very first law in Canada, the very first prohibition law, was the Indian Act, and it selected a subset of the population, and it said that they could not be intoxicated. That was illegal. And so the government has been restricting people, and of course Indigenous people still face the first and worst effects of the overdose crisis, dying in proportionately bigger numbers. And that's a complicated picture to paint to somebody, but that's where we want to have the nuance instead of the simple answer.
Yes.
So when we say the system or the state, we're actually talking about a specific set of machinery that's staffed and by people who are appointed and elected, carrying out different policies under different laws. And those laws can be amended. And if you go to Health Canada's website, they have a model of the deaths that are predicted in the coming fiscal quarter, say. And so they with all their data, and they have a computer modeling that spits out several scenarios. So you can see the line, you know, goes up with these thousands and thousands of deaths. And you can see the line goes up worse if we don't do anything and the drug supply gets worse. You can see the line starting to go straight if we start to do things. If we put in a lot of harm reduction stuff, the line starts to curve down. And it's very precise. So they're predicting, if they do this policy or don't do this policy, exactly how many people will die if they decide to not follow that scenario and not spend more money on harm reduction or not do those changes. And so that takes us back to necropolitics, right? They are deciding who will live and who will die. And it's a political calculation, because the things that we're looking for, safe supply, decriminalization, these are politically very unpopular because of all of the fear-mongering of the right.
Of course.
But that's the system. And if you look at any social phenomenon that's oppressing, exploiting, or killing people, you'll find the same kinds of complicated machinery at work. But if we want to take seriously any large task of social change, we have to understand the enemy that we're tangling with. And that's where you have to start. Not everybody likes to do that, but
do you have any read on what the actual, like, because, you know, I hear you explain that, and it's just like, it baffles my mind to think that there can be, whether it's a politician or just a human, it just baffles my mind that someone can reason through why to not do something that they know would help someone else.
It's split up so that no human, except for maybe the prime minister or the premier, has that much control, right? Most people have like this one piece of this one regulation under this one law. So no one has, do they live or do they die?
Right.
Everyone's playing a small role under the system. And it's not that people don't know. They have that modeling. They've seen the evidence. You know, the premier knows the decisions he's making, and the prime minister does too. And they just think, if I was to do these things, I would lose votes and I wouldn't be elected and I wouldn't be in power. And so I wouldn't have any choice to do anything.
Yeah.
And that's the logic they're facing. I don't think anyone is saying, they're going to die. Great.
Right.
Although, sometimes there are some politicians that are so to the right and so hateful that they probably take some glee in it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, this is the kind of calculation. This is why, instead of thinking of an evil group of people, I think of necropolitics. I think of a structure, because it's not just people in BC or Vancouver or Canada. This is happening to groups of people all over the world.
Yeah. And just the bureaucracy of it is really quite horrific.
Yeah. I mean, before there was a vaccine out for COVID, for example, they were modeling deaths and deciding how much deaths is it acceptable for us to open up businesses.
Right.
They were having systems in hospitals like, if we have to ration ventilators, who gets them? Right. So there are these calculations. It's just what's lost for us. If we live, nobody else dies. We're not taking anything away from anybody else. It just takes political courage. So that's the thing that they stand to lose, is maybe political points. But I actually think there's an appetite in voters in Canada for real leadership, for people not just like humming and hawing and tweaking at the edges, but really solving some of these problems. Because it seems that governments of all stripes have given up trying to solve any kind of social problem and just decide we're going to manage it.
Just maintain, right? And I think that's the thing that appeals to people. I think some of this more extreme right movement is that it messages that it's a radical solution, right? And it energizes them and it moves them. And while I don't agree with them in any way, shape, or form, I can understand what grabs people, right? Because
absolutely, Pierre Poilievre is saying it's unfair on this generation or the next generation, because they're getting squeezed. They won't ever own a house. They're not getting paid properly.
He's just blaming the wrong people.
Yeah, and if this guy gets elected, he's not going to go on a massive program of public housing. He's not going to go on a pro-unionization campaign. He's not going to subsidize groceries.
No.
This guy is on the side of the ruling class. Unfortunately, so are the Liberals. Like, we just don't really have any choice federally.
Yeah.
I mean, the two parties that are contending for power, that have been in power for the whole history of this country, are both aligned with the corporate ruling class. And so we just get two different flavors of you're going to die.
Yeah.
Or maybe we get, it's too bad that you're going to die. Or, well, it's your flawed character. You're more failing that you're going to die.
Right. Maybe if you're a better person.
Yes.
Then
So
you're right.
it just depends. But we're dying either way.
Do you, how much of an impact do you feel municipal politics plays in sort of your own day-to-day life, or in the day-to-day life of Vandu and of the programs that you work with?
I think for people who are living on the downtown east side, for example, the amount of policing that has been poured into that neighborhood by the current mayor and council is extreme. Like, there's just, that place has always been policed a lot, but there's just, it's just pouring in there. Like the corner of Hastings and Carroll is almost indicted. Like one of the cops talks about clearing that corner on the news, and sure enough, they're always down there. And there's people selling rock down there and selling like stolen candy bars or whatever. But is this improving people's quality of life to just constantly be clearing that corner?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. You have any hope for like Cope or Sean Orr?
Sean Orr is great.
Yeah.
Right? Sean Orr's fantastic. Love that guy.
Yeah.
I was glad to see him elected. His election shows, he's basically a socialist. He really ran on being a socialist. We need more socialism in the city. We've had way too much late stage capitalism, way too much people just making money hand over fist on land and real estate. And before him, Jean Swanson played that role. And she was a great advocate against poverty and for decent housing for people. And I mean, those are really old ideas, but that's what we need. We need that old campaigning. People need a union for their workplace, a decent wage, a decent place to live. Like, we've done all this stuff before. When I was growing up in this town, you didn't have tent cities everywhere. And it's because you could get a place for cheap. You could actually afford to feed yourself and rent a place on welfare or on EI. Like, you just can't do that. Right? They have made it. They've made a class of people ostracized. Like, they've banished people from the economy. And what do you think is going to happen if a group of people aren't invited? You know, they're going to have to live somewhere. So like, this is the consequence, and people don't feel safe. I think that's a problem. Everyone has to be safe.
Sure.
Everyone's got to feel safe. Everyone's got to feel safe, or no one gets to feel safe, right? And
Yeah,
that includes people who have no housing. It does not feel safe to live outside, live on the street. I haven't been homeless myself for many, many years, but it does not feel safe, right? So we want a society that's safe, security for everybody.
Circling back to something, you know, a big element of what I'm always trying to scratch at on the show is the idea of community and community building, and how do we sort of, you know, how do we foster these connections? And I'm curious, you know, the Van Du work that you do and the drug user rights movement that you are part of, it, from the book at least, you know, I can't speak for you personally, but from the book, it looks like it's really given a lot back to you in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
You even described it in the book, and earlier in the interview, we talked about the idea of like the shedding of shame and the shedding of these things.
That's
right?
who took it off me.
Yeah. Right. And it really strikes me that it's a community that is very much built on the idea of mutual survival, like you said, right? You know, safety for all, right? And I'm curious how, I guess, I don't know, there's a few directions I want to go with the question, but it's the idea of like, how does that look in the lived sort of day to day from your perspective, kind of on the ground of being within a mutual survival community? Because I don't think everybody's, you know, we're not all in something like that, right? You know, we're sometimes we're in our own little bubbles, or sometimes we're in different communities, you know?
Yeah.
And on top of that, sort of how do you make something like that work?
Well, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's always sort of wobbling and kind of falling apart and putting it back together. On a day-to-day, it's, you know, it's sitting in a little meeting room and reading out the minutes from the last meeting and deciding what we're working on, and, you know, putting out the chairs for a big membership discussion, you know, where we're going to hear what's going on, you know, what are people facing, you know, working on different campaigns, you know, like what kind of struggle are we organizing? Like, you know, it could be big things like decriminalization, for example, but also people at Van Du have fought for a 30-kilometer speed limit on the street because so many people were getting killed.
Yeah.
So they can be very small things too. And I've benefited immensely from struggles that came, people who struggled before me. Like, Van Du's been around since the late 90s. I only joined about 15 years ago. But the people who came before me fought for more methadone spaces. They were highly rationed, and I couldn't get on the program when I first tried. They fought for 1,000 spaces, and I was able to get on the next time I tried. And that sort of fight is often just like getting on the phone and setting up a meeting with some assistant to the ministerial assistant to try and get this on their agenda, and then eventually meet with the minister, but you got to get your other people and prepare for the meeting. And, you know, it's like, building community like that just looks like that sort of thing. And in between that, maybe you're trying to get coffee for everybody, and just, you know, we also try and make sure everybody's well, not like nobody's dope sick at the meeting, you know, and if somebody's dope sick, maybe someone has a little extra methadone or a little something to help them out. And then you have a smoke break, and, you know, so it's like that. It's just like, it's like organizing, you know, that's mostly what it is. It's 99% doing minutes and stacking chairs, and 1% having a press conference or a rally or something that looks more, you know, shiny.
But isn't that the case for everything, though? Hey, the idea of like,
absolutely.
even like, you know, something like a book, right? It's like, oh, it must have been you just sit down and write a book. And it's like, no, there's a million things that go into it. And then all you see is now the book, right?
Yeah, like how many emails are associated with this book? 1,000? I don't know. A lot, right? But I think
that probably that could be a book in itself. It's just all the emails, right? You know,
I would not read it.
No.
You know, whoever you are, organizing in your community, it's the right thing to do, right? Because there's probably something that's wrong or broken about where you live or what's going on, and knowing your neighbors and being together with them to organize something also brings more richness to your life. You know, our bubbles, our relations have all gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. You know, back in the I think the 60s or 70s, people knew 50 people, and now people know 5 people or
Yeah.
something. I can't remember, some study like
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't know whether it's their friends or acquaintances or
Sure,
whatever,
sure.
but it's like this principle of loneliness, and I think it's been identified by lots of health scientists, public health scientists, that it's like as bad as smoking, and that it's really killing people, and the antidote to that is being a part of a community or being a part of your community. And you look at the people in Minneapolis, right? They basically threw ice out of that place
Yeah.
by mutual aid, mutual survival,
Yeah.
right? This Gestapo was storming these neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Immigrants couldn't go out of their house. They were so scared. And so the whole community organized to bring people food. So we saw on TV people throwing cans of tear gas back at the ice or
Yes.
whatever.
Yeah.
But probably that was 1% of the action. And
Yeah.
then the rest of it was, making soup to give to people
Yeah.
and getting donations of Huggies organized, diapers, to give
Yeah.
to the young family that can't go out and get diapers.
Yeah.
And that's what organizing is maybe you're the person who's dropping off the diapers. But it's not just about diapers. It's like all the people you talk to in doing that.
Yeah.
And then you're going to need that help one day yourself, or maybe it's even something small, maybe it's just like, does anybody have a drill? I need to fix my bookshelf or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just that's what a society should be like. That's what our society used to
It
be
was,
like. Right?
yeah.
This is also when we talk about late stage capitalism and necropolitics. This is all like our friendships have been commodified by
Yes.
the root of this podcast, by Facebook, and by our attention has been commodified, and our identity has been sort of boiled down to a pattern of likes and consumer habits. Our lives are so much richer in analog. I just think that's part of the way we need to live again. And for us, we just don't have a choice. This is how we survive. Part of what it looks like on the day to day is this. In the last year, since my son was born, I've resuscitated 3 people with naloxone, like found people who I did not know who were overdosing and helped them.
Yeah.
And so sometimes what we do for each other is we bring each other back to life.
Yeah.
And that's good for both people,
Of
it's
course.
traumatizing, like it's scary, but it also makes me feel good. Like I'm glad the person's alive.
Exactly.
I saw this guy, Kyle, walking down the street the other day. He's smiling and waving at me, and I don't even know if he remembers, but he'd be dead if I wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. God damn. I was just reading a thing about how monopoly laws were changed in like the 70s or the 80s, and that's a big factor in why now the internet is just like 5 websites and all these things, and just just everything used to be more not even, not level, but it was like there, people had a shot, in a way that it doesn't exist anymore, and yeah, I think
Life has become flattened,
that's just it, right?
you
Yeah,
look
when
at
it's
like
just 4 people telling
know-
you what's good,
and look at the inside of like a coffee shop that's like got that smooth, like it looks like, is it a coffee shop or an Apple store or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah.
And wait, doesn't the living room of our house look like that? And the school looks like that, and everything kind of looks and feels this kind of flattened, bland, clean but efficient way, And so it's just like if you want to buy or order something, that's instant. But if you want to meet your friend, maybe that gets canceled 3 times. You have to text 8 times to arrange it or whatever. Like all the things that used to be so easy and just part of the richness of life have been somehow smushed out for a lot of people,
And there's no like tactile element, right? It's all just flat glass, right?
I mean, people buy records and they'll tell you, oh, it's because of the richness of the sound or
Sure.
whatever. And I'm a vinyl idiot too, but
Sure.
it's because you can hold it. It's
Yeah.
because you dropping the needle makes you actually listen to the
Yep.
thing instead of listen to 10 seconds and then surf on to something else.
You have to, and with listening to a record is an active activity. You have to get up, you have to change it. You can't just like autoplay and let it go, right? I think about that with books. I have a e-reader that I never use because I don't want to, because it doesn't feel like a book.
That's right. Look where we're sitting. Right?
Exactly.
And there's people been walking in and out here the whole time we've been talking because they want to take ideas and hold them in their hand.
That's it right there. Yeah. Earlier on, you had brought up this idea about how one of the really central tensions is this idea of within many kinds of activism, but around drug use is this idea of often the most affected by the issue are the ones who have to fight the hardest to be believed or just to be heard.
Yeah,
absolutely. How do you find yourself approaching sort of thinking of the role of allyship, or like the people, for people who maybe aren't as directly impacted by something, but want to support or whatever it might be. How do you initially sort of approach that role from your perspective? I'm trying to sort of, I've got a few questions about sort of like what can people do to help, basically, you know what I mean? But I think, being a part of the queer community, I think, hearing the word ally makes me want to vomit, right? So I'm always curious about the from the actual community, what is the perspective of allyship?
Well, I think the different communities we've worked with, like we organized along with Black Lives Matter before, and we organized with like disability communities before. And I think it's that coalition idea too. It's like whoever you are, you're probably of something, and if you organize with that group, then you can do something in solidarity with a group like Van Do, right?
Yeah.
That's the most powerful kind of solidarity. Not leaving where you are, but organizing where you are, because you're somewhere. Maybe you're somewhere we aren't.
Yeah.
So somebody called me up a long time ago with this question, like, "Oh, what can I do?" And I said, "Well, where are you? Alberta. What do you do?" "I work in the craft brewing industry." I said, "Start where you are. Like you're among small business people in a province where the small business community is sort of owned by the United Conservative Party, which is very hostile to harm reduction.
Oh yeah.
We're not there at all. Like this is a great place to start." And so this guy organized Each and Every, which is now a national campaign that started with a few craft breweries who brewed a beer called Each and Every. And it was started with businesses around Calgary, I think, just trying to get on board with a overdose prevention site in the neighborhood and not trying to shut it down. And he's been really successful at bringing everybody along and working in solidarity with drug user and harm reduction groups. And he's made this coast to coast thing. And I'm sure I'm not explaining it well enough, but Ewan Thompson is now so deep into this. He writes a blog called Drug Policy Decoded, and it's like a really great source of information. But he started with that question, and so I never say, "Oh, come down and volunteer," or something like that. I say, start where you are, because you're probably somewhere where we aren't.
Yeah. I think that's such a valuable perspective. And I think that's one that can be applied to, not only just these issues, but just anything, in that it's like, because I think one of the pushbacks that often gets heard is this idea of like, the person who kind of means well, but shows up imperfectly, ends up kind of making things, not necessarily making it worse, but ends up kind of like, just doing something wrong or making it harder, right? And so if the attitude is like, take up the space you have already, rather than taking up, space that needs to be occupied somewhere else,
Yeah.
Well,
or just like if you're a university teacher, like maybe you're part of a faculty association or something like that, right? And that's a campus is an incredible site of harm reduction, for harm reduction, and like these are places where we really aren't, or Van Du isn't, but that's how any social movement, just like you said, can be organized. We need to be everywhere in society, because drug users are dying everywhere in society.
Yeah.
We come from every neighborhood and every economic background, every part of the world, and the coroner finds us in every kind of condition. And so that's where we need to organize. That's where we need to be organizing.
Well, and I think it also relates to the idea of like, everyone has to be safe, and that means everyone, and that means everywhere, right? I'm going to start just a little bit of a wrap up here. I have a billion more questions that I could ask you, but I feel like I don't want to keep you all afternoon. But building on that a little, the idea of, let's say somebody listens to this, they go pick up your book, they finish your book, and now they've been radicalized, right? They fully, their mind is completely altered, and that is not something I see out of the realm of possibility, to be honest. What do you think is the most useful thing that they could do, just like on a Tuesday? Like not some big grand thing, but like just like what's something they could, you spoke of like, where are you, but like.
Right.
But like, sort of, what could they do just like on a, on a random Tuesday?
We built the podcast for this sort of thing, right? So maybe people have a couple of friends, who they consume media with, right? So we made the podcast so you could play an episode and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have heard from people who are doing this. You know, there was a group of people who used to meet and they called it Crafts and Crackdown in Toronto, and they would do knitting or something, you know, or cross stitching and listen to the podcast or coloring, you know, adult coloring books or whatever. I don't mean like dodgy coloring books. I mean like, you know what I mean? Anyway, like, so like they did this and listened to the podcast and had a discussion afterwards. And that started with their friends or coworkers or whatever.
Yeah.
A real simple thing, you know, just get Narcan training. You can look it up online. You can even do it online if you want to. The website is called Toward the Heart here in BC, but anybody can access it. It's got really good videos on there. And, you know, get yourself a naloxone kit, you know. It's basically, it's simpler than learning first aid.
It was like a half hour. It was so fast.
Yeah. And, you know, you'll at least feel better. And it's not something that, you know, a far off bureaucracy or some kind of medical organization has given to you. This is from us to you. This is our movement fought for this. Governments and medical authorities tried to hold this away from us all through the last overdose crisis. We couldn't get our hands on this. In fact, there's a guy from Chicago, Dan Big, who used to smuggle this stuff into Canada for us so that we could have naloxone.
In the 90s.
Yeah.
Good
Finally,
Lord.
it's, well, up until 2014, I think.
Holy
And
fuck.
so we fought and fought and fought for this. Finally, we could get it by prescription. We continued to fight. Anyone can have it. Anyone, everyone should have it. If you have a first aid kit, have this, right? Like, say you got an old elderly relative that's taking pain medication. They're forgetful, and so they took their pain medication twice in a day or 3 times. Narcan could help save them.
Yeah.
It's a good skill to have.
Yeah.
So that's a real simple thing, and this is our community fought for this. So it's like from us to you. Then you're part of that fight. You're part of that tradition.
Garth fucking Mullins, holy shit! I could listen to you talk for the whole afternoon, and I would try to not interject too much, you know.
Well, thanks a lot, James. It's been a real honor to be on your podcast and here at the bookshop and Debbie having us here. And it was really nice. Debbie, thank you for the books for my kid. He's gonna love them.
Do you have anything you want to plug? Anywhere you want listeners to find you? Where do they go next?
Well, if you've read the book and listened to the podcast, you probably need a break from me. So I'd say go outside, you know.
Yeah, touch grass.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Thanks for having me, you guys. It's been really nice to be here, and I just stay safe and keep 6.
And that was Garth Mullins. I mean, yeah, I don't have a lot of words left after that one. What I keep coming back to in sitting with this conversation is something that Garth said near the end. He said that sometimes what we do for each other is we bring each other back to life. And, you know, he said it in the context of naloxone, of literally resuscitating people. But I think that it applies to everything that we talked about in that room. The grief, the shame, organizing, the community that holds itself together by showing up for each other over and over and over again in those small, unglamorous, but necessary ways. So, if this episode moved you, and I really hope it did, please go pick up a copy of Crackdown. It's available wherever books are sold, and I promise you, it will stay with you. You can also find Garth's podcast, also called Crackdown, wherever you find your podcasts. And if you want to do something concrete, something you can do this week, you know, after listening, whatever, go to towardtheheart.com and get yourself a free naloxone kit and naloxone training. That's Garth's ask, and I fully second it because I think it's a pretty good one. Links to all those resources, as well as to Van Du, if you want to learn more about that work, are going to be in the show notes to this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the Book Warehouse for hosting us, and thank you so much to Garth for everything, for the book, for this conversation, and just for the work that he and his community continues to do. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. And as always, I hope I'm going to catch you back here next week for another one. But hey, I'm not going to worry about that right now, and neither should you, because that is then and this is now. So for now, I'm going to get back into bed, and I'm going to say I love you, and I hope you take care of each other out there. Fun and safety, sweet peas.